So when we started talking about performance appraisal, one of the things I was talking about in the first set of slides was the idea of a contextual approach. That basically early research on performance appraisal was mainly focused on increasing accuracy and decreasing errors, creating a reliable and valid measure of performance appraisal, especially when we're after subjective or hard to measure performance. Then we talked about the various rating scales and also the various errors that can occur in those rating scales. What we're going to talk about now is the actual contextual research, so research that's been done about the actual use of performance appraisal in organizations. So, an overview of this contemporary performance appraisal research. We're going to talk about reaction criteria, in other words, how people react to performance appraisal. We're going to talk about the importance of recognizing that the pre-existing relationships between the supervisor and the subordinate will impact how people perceive performance appraisal. We're going to talk about how organizational politics can impact performance appraisal. We're going to talk briefly about the research that's found that basically giving raters goals and also holding raters accountable to their performance appraisals increases accuracy. And we're going to talk about one of the major tools for including all of this contextual information into a more effective performance appraisal system. Multi-source feedback or 360 feedback is currently being used and how it's used in organizations. Finally, we're going to talk about once we have that feedback, how the knowledge, participation, and development of that appraisal system all impact, again, how it's used. So reaction criteria, the idea here is that we want to focus on the role of the rater and the ratee's reactions in the performance appraisal process. It's often a class of neglected criteria that might be critical in evaluating the success of an appraisal. The basic idea here is that if we are wanting performance appraisal to be useful, we don't want to use it just to tell someone how well they're doing or how poorly they're doing. We want them to accept the performance feedback and specifically the developmental suggestions of how they could perform better. So how people react to that feedback is very important. Research has found that performance appraisal satisfaction is affected by performance appraisal characteristics and organizational variables, which means that the way performance is given, so the interchange, is it being given by a superior? Is it being given in writing versus in person? Is it including with both positive and negative feedback in the same conversation? So for example, research has found that generally speaking, people react better to feedback if it's used in the sandwich method. Positive feedback, developmental or negative feedback, more positive feedback. People tend to attend better when they are getting some praise, but also some actionable things to work on. So that's one of the factors. Also, what's going on in the organization. So feedback is going to be perceived very differently in an organization where there's a lot of growth and no chance of termination than it is going to be perceived in the same organization if it's currently downsizing and people know that people may be terminated based on these decisions. So again, the environmental impact, what's going on in the around the organization, is important to determining how people are going to perceive feedback. And if the goal of giving feedback is to try to make sure it actually is actionable, actionable, and can be resulting in development or the increase of the employee's performance, these are factors that need to be addressed and considered, possibly even measured. And these factors are another thing that an industrial organizational psychologist can bring to an organization. The knowledge of how to measure and to look at the organization and go, are we in a good position to be providing feedback in a way that's going to be listened to by our employees? Subordinates tend to report less anger and higher perceptions of justice when the ratings are justified. So again, if ratings are just being delivered, they're usually viewed less positively. They're usually seen somewhat as unjust compared to if they're delivered with justifications. Here's the behaviors that we're seeing that resulted in you getting these ratings. Performance appraisals are also viewed as unfair, are related to a ratings emotional exhaustion. So again, if you're looking at a high-stress environment, if you're looking at employees that are relatively emotionally exhausted, even a good performance appraisal system may be reacted negatively to in that kind of an environment. So just saying broadly, performance appraisal, if managed correctly, is going to result in good outcomes is not quite true. You need to also take into account what's going on in the organization and what the state of the employees that are getting this feedback is. Another major factor to consider is the supervisor-subordinate relationship. This draws mainly from a theory called LMX theory, or leader membership exchange theory. And the idea here is that supervisors will have different relationships with different subordinates. And this makes sense. We rarely have equal relationships with large groups of people. Think about the friends that you commonly do things with. You probably have different levels or different types of relationships with those friends. It's unlikely that you have 8 close friends that are all exactly at the same level with you. You treat them the same, you think about them the same. I know in my case, I have a couple of very close friends amongst my coworkers. I have some acquaintances, and then I have people that basically I just say hi in the hallway to. That's the idea of LMX, that you want to be able to actually look at these relationships, because the way feedback is going to work between a leader and a subordinate that have a very strong relationship is going to be different than how that feedback is going to be related or viewed by someone that has a very weak relationship with their supervisor. So performance appraisal research has ignored the role of this for the most part. It's important because the relationship between an employee and a supervisor plays a major role in the performance appraisal process. In fact, good performance management is really involving the idea that the supervisor is going to provide coaching and actionable feedback to the employees. So the idea that all employees would treat this information the same is relatively naive. The way LMX theory is often kind of conceptualized is the frequency of communication interacts with LMX to affect performance ratings. So basically what this says is that if you have a strong relationship between the supervisor and the subordinate, and they have frequent communication, that is the ideal area where you're going to find the best outcome of performance appraisal being delivered. When you have someone that has a poor relationship with their supervisor and infrequent communication, that's when the performance appraisal process is probably going to be least successful. So LMX theory basically suggests that leaders form an in-group and an out-group with their subordinates, that they have favored individuals that are in the in-group, and that generally speaking, that group you're going to find higher morale, higher commitment, higher job performance, and they'll be more positive and react more positively to developmental feedback from performance appraisal. There's also the out-group that is generally the not favored individuals, and it's important to note that not always is this group going to be negatively viewed. It's simply they're not favored. They're not seen as being in the in-group by the leader. They generally tend to have a little lower morale, lower commitment, lower job performance, and often will react more poorly to performance appraisal. Now, if you're looking at this and go, well, maybe the reason they're not favored is that they actually have lower job performance, and the reason the in-group is favored is they have higher job performance to begin with. But there's actually been experimental studies that have brought LMX into the lab where they've randomly divided people into in-groups and out-groups, measured their performance prior to any intervention, and then have a leader come in and start favoring one group and not favoring the other, and then remeasuring job performance. There is a direct causal effect that we find in that kind of an experimental study, where the group that's suddenly favored, their performance improves, and the group that's suddenly finding themselves kind of shut out, their performance decreases. Organizational politics are also important to consider when we're talking about performance appraisal, because the performance appraisal system is very susceptible to organizational politics. Now, when we talk about organizational politics in industrial organizational psychology, we're almost universally talking about a negative thing. Politics, and maybe that's your opinion of politics in other settings, but definitely the term in organizations is a negative. The idea is that when you're talking about a political action in an organization, it's an action that is no longer directly tied to the goals of the organization. So the definition I've got here is a deliberate attempt by individuals to enhance or protect their self-interest when conflicting courses of action are possible. It basically means a political action is if you have choices on the table, and some of those choices may lead to a personal self-interest, and some of them may not be serving your self-interest, but would actually be better for the company, you go for the self-interest. So how this can work on a very small level is that if you're doing performance appraisal and you're doing a self-rating, what would be to the best goal of the organization would for you to accurately rate your own self-performance without any actual attempt to change the ratings. What would be in your self-interest, though, was to rate yourself very highly, hoping to draw attention and promotion. So performance appraisal, by its nature, is susceptible to politics. My example previously, when I was talking in the previous set of slides about how I had a manager that only tended to use recency effect. They would always basically observe behavior about a week before they had to actually do performance appraisals. And I always ramped up my behaviors and made sure I was doing a lot of good work during that period. That was a political act. What would be good for the organization is if I did that kind of behavior 24/7 every week. I didn't. I only did it when I knew it was promotion time. That was a political act, and I will admit that I shouldn't have been doing it, but that's what I did. That's organizational politics. Executives will often intentionally manipulate performance appraisal for political reasons. So they might want to make a particular department look good. They might want to send a negative message to subordinates. So anytime the performance appraisal system is being used as a communication tool and not an accurate measure of performance, that again is political. Subordinates will often use impression management to bring about favorable impressions, so they control their behaviors to make good impressions of their supervisor. Again, that is political. Now, some of this is just human nature, but it's important to recognize that these are factors, bias, or error that can contaminate the performance appraisal process. So the rater goals and accountability. Raters may often have various different goals for various reasons on how they're giving out ratings, but when held accountable to goals and objectives, rating accuracy, rating leniency, raters tend to provide ratings consistent with those goals. So if you tell someone that we want you to rate everyone very highly, most people will do it. If you tell people we want you to make sure that you're giving accurate ratings, most people will do it. So when you set goals, those goals do tend to change the ratings that raters are giving. Some types of raters are more affected by these accountability pressures than others. Basically, we find those, for example, that are higher in conscientiousness, their ratings will change more when they're given specifically accountable goals. The most important thing to recognize here is that if these subtle differences can change how people rate, if you just can tell people, I want you to be more accurate in this particular time, and suddenly they are more accurate, that gives us an idea that ratings had error in them to begin with. If we didn't find changes for these kind of interventions, we'd be more confident that the ratings we were getting to begin with were accurate. What's also been found is that when you are held accountable to accuracy or fairness in your ratings, generally those ratings are also more likely to be accurate. In other words, they're more likely to be related to other more objective measures of performance. So, one of the answers to almost all the problems we've discussed in rating systems is the multi-source feedback. It's also often referred to as 360-degree feedback. It involves multiple raters at various organizational levels who evaluate and provide feedback to the target employees. Generally, it'll involve your direct subordinates, your peers, the people you work with, your supervisor or supervisors, the people that are directly managing you. If you directly interact with clients or customers, they would be included as well. And finally, your own self-ratings. It's used for purposes consistent with the greater employee expectations of the 21st century. So let me talk about first what it is and second what that means. So what it basically is that instead of drawing your ratings from one person, we're going to draw your performance ratings from numerous raters. The advantage to this is twofold. First, from a cognitive model, you're now going to be drawing multiple people that have the opportunity to observe and encode, to store, and to recall information about your performance. So there's going to be a lot more data sources for us to get an accurate picture of your performance. Also, if various people in that group of all the people rating you have error, if there's one person that tends to be extra lenient, if there's one person that tends to be extra severe, if there's one person that tends to dislike you and give you lower ratings because of that, the effect of that is going to be much smaller because it's going to be averaged with everyone else. So generally speaking, we find by combining the average ratings of all these sources, we tend to get more accurate and less bias or less error in our ratings. Now, if you use 360-degree feedback for the purposes of decision making, it's not a very good idea because it suddenly becomes a very political process. In other words, your self-ratings are probably always going to be off the chart because you're wanting the promotion. Your peers are probably going to rate you very lowly because they want their own self-ratings to make them look better than you. Your subordinates and customers and supervisor might also be aware of this. So generally speaking, that second main bullet point, or third main bullet point, used for the purposes consistent with greater employee expectations in 21st century organizations, it's really a great tool for the development of employees. So the three basic assumptions of 360-degree feedback: when multiple raters are used, participants are happier because they're involved in the process. So the first thing is that participants across organizations tend to be more accepting of feedback from 360-degree because they know where the ratings are coming from. They know their ratings are not just coming from a manager, they're coming from their peers and their subordinates, and their own ratings are included in the system. When these multiple raters are used, the idiosyncrasies, I'm not being able to pronounce that word today. Their idiosyncrasies or biases of any single rater are overcome. What that means is that if you've got someone that's prone to one particular type of error or another, their impact on the ratings is much smaller because it's going to be averaged across multiple raters. And finally, the third major assumption is that multiple raters bring multiple perspectives for a broader, more accurate view of performance. Multiple raters have more opportunities to see the behaviors that are associated with performance. Multiple raters are more likely to average out the errors that occur in performance appraisal. And finally, because the ratee themselves are included in the process, they're going to be more open to the feedback. So this allows development. 360-degree feedback is one of our best tools. And again, the downside of 360-degree feedback is, first, it's hard to use it for decision-making reasons. You really can't use 360 for decision-making in organizations. If you're using 360 to determine who gets promoted and who gets fired, very quickly you're going to find a lot of the benefits of 360 start to disappear. It really is focused on development. Another downside is it is somewhat time-consuming to collect and gather all that data. A lot of consulting firms in IO psychology, what they mainly do is provide 360-degree feedback to various organizations. So they're the ones collecting all this data, summarizing it, and creating the reports. So development. Employee development is largely a function of their receptivity to feedback. So if you want employees to develop, partly what you have to do is not just give them feedback, but how are they receiving that feedback? And how does the organization approach and put emphasis on that feedback? This has led to the idea of continuous employee development, and it's very similar again to that idea of performance management, a cyclic process in which employees are motivated to plan for and engage in actions or behaviors that benefit their future employability on a repetitive and ongoing basis. So again, the idea of using 360-degree feedback, using performance appraisal to provide information to people, individual employees, on how they can develop. So participation can be in the form of self-assessment or just expressing ideas, and participation is an important part of the performance appraisal process. So if you're wanting to do continuous employee development, if you're wanting to do performance management, there has to be an opportunity for the person under evaluation to provide their self-assessment. This can definitely be done through 360-degree feedback, as self-assessment is a part of the data collected, but it can also be done using the other forms of performance appraisal that we've discussed, by simply having the face-to-face, person-to-person communication between the supervisor and the subordinate, and letting the subordinate basically address the concerns, the ratings, and agree or disagree, and provide an opportunity for them to respond. A meta-analysis found a very positive relationship between employee participation in the performance appraisal process and employees' reactions to appraisal. Now remember, a meta-analysis is a study of a bunch of studies. So this was a meta-analysis where they found all of the studies prior to 1998 that had looked at what's the relationship between how much an employee participates in the performance appraisal process and how they react or development based on that process. And what the meta-analysis of all these studies found was there was a positive relationship. The more participation, the better the performance appraisal is going to be received, and the more likely that successful development will occur. So let's briefly talk about some of the legal issues in performance appraisal. So in the United States, it's illegal to discriminate in performance appraisal on the basis of non-performance related factors: age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and disability currently. Also, individual states and municipalities may also have additional protected classes. So anyone in that class, if they can show that their performance appraisal included some information, bias if you will, error if you will, based on these factors, they have a legal option to challenge that performance appraisal. Now, it's important to note that the important words here is non-performance related factor. If age is a performance related factor, then it can be used as a part of a performance appraisal. An example of this is the U.S. military has a maximum age which they'll accept into their ranks. That's not illegal, as there has been studies that have found that after a certain age, people do not have the physical reaction time, strength, and endurance to do some of the aspects of the job. Airline pilots have a maximum age, at which point they can be relieved if there's other factors going on. Another example of this is sometimes an employee or an organization will create a job that includes as a part of its performance-related factors something about the person's physical attributes. A very good example of this was brought up by the kind of humorous picture here of the male Hooters girl. Hooters, the restaurant, successfully defended their right to hire attractive women as their only wait staff because a man did sue, claiming he was being discriminated based on the gender. What Hooters had to do in a court of law was prove that a part of their brand, or actually a part of the job itself, what Hooters sells, partly isn't just wings and bar food, it's also a particular image. And this has actually been proven in court in some other cases. There is a restaurant in, I just forgot the name of the place, New Orleans. In New Orleans, Louisiana, there's a restaurant that basically their theme, what they project as far as their image, is an old style kind of plantation feel. And they only hire African American men as waiters. Again, a white woman sued to become waitstaff there, and once again the courts ruled that in this particular case, race was a performance-related factor because that was a requirement of the image of the restaurant. Now, generally speaking, it's hard to prove this in a court of law, and it's definitely a dangerous road for an organization to go down, but it's worth noting that it isn't like there's a carte blanche or open ban from using age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or disability in hiring. But it has to be shown that it has nothing to do with performance, and then if it is being used as a part of performance appraisal, that's actionable. So let's briefly talk about legal issues of performance appraisal. What really has been done here is very applied research that has looked at basically the recommendations for performance appraisal. In other words, suggestions to organizations of what their performance appraisal should look like if they want to be protected from legal action. So Austin, Villanova, and Heinemann in 1995 suggested, based on a review of legal cases, that organizations that want a strong performance appraisal system that is resistant to legal challenge should always start with a job analysis. And that job analysis should be what is used to develop the performance criteria. Performance criteria is, again, what we're actually measuring with performance appraisal. They should communicate performance standards in writing. In other words, organizations should provide to each employee that is going to be evaluated the performance appraisal system what that system looks like and what good behavior or good performance is. The standard should be communicated in writing. It should recognize separate dimensions of performance rather than just one overall rating. So, and again, when an organization has a performance appraisal system that's simply one rating or a comparison system, that's generally not as good as if there is specific dimensions drawn from the job analysis that each person's being rated on. There's a strong suggestion to use both objective and subjective criteria. So if you can gather objective criteria, such as numbers of day absent, number of days late, amount of money sales, amount of clients, that those should be included in the performance appraisal system along with the more subjective ratings. Employees should have an access to appeal. So a performance appraisal, when given, the employee should have that ability to come in and communicate and to provide information that might change the rating. It should use multiple raters if possible. So again, a good performance appraisal system is not going to rely on a single rater. Everything should be documented. And finally, the raters themselves, if possible, should be trained If that's not possible, they should at least be given strong written instructions for conducting the performance appraisal. And this is another area where that idea of BARS, behavioral anchor rating skills, come in, because by their very nature, BARS are a written instruction for how to conduct a performance appraisal. Expanding on this has been a couple of studies that have looked at actual court decisions of legal challenges to performance appraisal to determine what key components of performance appraisal was most likely to result in an organization successfully defending a challenge. So in Warner and Bellino in 1997 reviewed approximately 15 years of court cases. They looked at over 300 court cases, and what they found was that across the board, judgments were more likely made for the defendant, which is the organization. This is the company that had a performance appraisal, that an individual is basically suing, claiming they were treated wrongly. And you can see up there 109 of those cases were age discrimination, 102 were race discrimination, and 50 were sex discrimination. What was found is that if the performance appraisal was based on a job analysis, much more likely that the defendant, the organization, won the case. If there was written instructions for performance appraisals and those written instructions were used, if employees had an opportunity to review the appraisals, if multiple raters had agreed on the ratings, and if rater training was used. All of these factors individually resulted in a more likelihood of the organization defending their performance appraisal. And clearly, the more that you had, the more and more likely your performance appraisal was legally defendable. So this has kind of led us to the due process metaphor for performance appraisal. So Folgers and colleagues in 1992 developed a model to help guide development of fair and legal defensible performance appraisal systems. And the idea was to move from the test process metaphor to the due process metaphor. Test process metaphor was primarily what we were talking about in the first two modules of this actual lecture set. And that's the idea of simply validating and finding a valid and reliable measure of performance. Due process metaphor is the more contextual one. It's the idea of once you have that very reliable and valid measure, how you use it is more important. Did it come from a just system such as clearly drawn from a job analysis? Is there a review process? Was there written instructions? Was there the ability for people to actually get the feedback directly? So the due process metaphor is based on the idea of fair hearings, adequate notice, and judgments based on evidence. So in other words, if you have a strong test process metaphor performance appraisal, all you're caring about is the accuracy of it. If you have a strong due process metaphor in your performance appraisal, you have a performance appraisal where people know what they're being rated on, adequate notice. You have a process that includes direct communication of that feedback and the potential to actually appeal that feedback, fair hearings. And finally, the judgment is based on evidence. In other words, when you are getting that feedback, you're being given specific behaviors of why you actually got those ratings. So all of these are built around the perceptions of justice. The idea that part of the performance appraisal system is not just getting accurate measures, but also convincing people that the performance information they're getting is just.